Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki a hau, ti hei Māori ora. E na mana e na reo au raka tira mā tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā katoa raro e te maru o ka mana whenua, ka te māmoe waitaha kaitahu, no mai haramai welcome. I stand here under the cloak of the people of this place, ka te māmoe waitaha kaitahu, and welcome you here. Ki te whare, tūnei, tēnā koe, tū tonu. And to the house that stands here, greetings, and may you stand forever. If that's under any threat, and we may need to evacuate out of this house, please follow the normal instructions for earthquakes, drop, cover and hold. Exits are outside, and I believe we will gather together outside the archway at some place. Ena mate haere hoki atu rā ki te po, and may we remember those that have passed in our families or in our wider communities. Ka waia, no otapoti ahau, ko Kotarani te iwi, he kai mai aho o tāko whakaihu ko Richard Blakey tāko inga. Good evening everyone, welcome to this wonderful event. My name is Richard Blakey, I'm Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise, and I'm the host for this inaugural professorial lecture where we celebrate the wonderful occasion of Professor Chrystal Jaye being promoted to our highest academic level at the university. I will just give it a little brief overview of the process and the order of proceedings tonight, largely to indicate what a significant event it is to those here, welcome, to those online, welcome as well, to be promoted. And that's why we put our regalia on, that's why we stop what we're doing and come and gather to hear about the research and teaching and service, the things that have come together in someone's life to lead them to this peak promotion in the university system. It's a promotion or an appointment that is not taken lightly, that clear criteria have to be met of sustained excellence, and sustained excellence is critical, and leadership across the three key areas of academic life, across teaching, across research and across service. And the purpose of the IPL is to allow the professor to profess on those areas should they wish to choose a particular area or focus on some things. And in particular, it's usual to acknowledge those that have helped and support the team effort that's required this to be achieved. What we'll see, so the order of proceedings is that I'll say a few words and then introduce Professor Lindley Anderson as the Acting Dean of the Dunedin School of Medicine to give a more formal introduction so you know more formally some of the qualifications that Chris brings. Chris will give her IPL, Professor Tim Stokes will summarise and give us a vote of thanks, and Megan Gibbons as the PVC in Sciences has a very important task of inviting us all to the staff club for the fellowship that will follow. I don't want to say too much, but I'm really pleased to be officiating at this IPL for you, Chris, because I've got to know you through one of your key university service roles. I know from your track record that your commitment to teaching is very high, including publishing in and about teaching and education and medical research, that your research is very strong, collaborative, focused on outcomes and impact. But your service to the university I've come to know through your role as Associate Dean Postgraduate in the Division of Health Sciences, a job that is huge, a job that involves such a wide range of disciplines and programs. And sitting on the Graduate Research Committee with you, I know what care for the students' well-being and outcomes for the students you bring to that role. So for that service, thank you, and it's great to be here with you in person, because for those of you online, you're going to be in the position that we are usually in, of seeing Chris on a TV monitor, because Chris usually zooms in from her rural home to join us at those meetings. So as well as thanking you for that service, I thank you for all your other service. And as I ask Lindley to come and give you a more formal welcome and introduction, I would like us to all join together in congratulating you, and me offering those congratulations on behalf of the university for such an awesome and well-earned promotion. So thank you very much. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, ko Lindley Anderson tōku ingoa. So welcome everyone present and to those who are attending online. My name is Lindley Anderson. I'm the Acting Dean of the Dunedin School of Medicine. and it is my role, but also my great pleasure, to introduce you to Professor Chrystal Jaye and to tell you a little bit about her. So first of all, I want to acknowledge some rather important people in the room. Her sister-in-law, Trish Bates, her grandchildren, Luca, Eva, and Leo Moyer. Unfortunately, her son couldn't be here, that's Kenny. But also attending online, some important people, Russell and Vivi in Taiwan, and Mark and Jess in Wellington. So welcome to you all. Now to tell you a little bit about Chris. So Chris's parents, Jill and Ivan Smith, lived in, many places, but her mother was a social worker and her dad had several careers, one as a gold and coal miner and the other as a Presbyterian minister. So Chris first came to Dunedin when her father came to university to study to be a Presbyterian minister. Then they went back to Nightcaps, and I looked up Nightcaps, has a population of about 300, I think. So Chris was admitted to the University of Otago in 1991 as a 28-year-old mature student to do a BA. She studied full-time as a single parent with 3 small boys. No mean feat. So she was invited to do honours at the end of her second year and majored in social anthropology. She was then admitted to her PhD, completing in 1998. She first worked in the university in the injury prevention unit and then got a job as a lecturer in the Department of General Practice. She was the first medical anthropologist to be employed in a medical school. That's just incredible. In New Zealand. This meant she brought a particular anthropological perspective on clinical practice and qualitative research, and she brought that lens to the Department of General Practice and Rural Health and to the Dunedin School of Medicine. Just some of the areas she's worked in: euthanasia, this is her research, euthanasia, prevention of age-related workplace injuries, and rural health and well-being. She's made a substantial contribution, as Richard said, to the postgraduate program in the Department of General Practice, going on to become the Associate Dean postgraduate for the Division of Health Sciences. This medical anthropologist thrived in medical school, and the Department of General Practice and Rural Health appointed her head of department from 2012 to 2016. This was the first non-doctor appointed as head of department of general practice, and the first woman. So she knocked it out of the park. Congratulations. She has also been a journal editor, a conference organiser, a mentor of women's staff and academic staff generally. She's had lots of different roles in the department, the division, the wider university, and internationally. She's currently in phased retirement and has been working part-time. In her out-of-work time, she loves to go hiking and e-biking and four-wheel driving around central Otago. She loves a good DIY project too, but she says her enthusiasm kind of outstrips her competence. She also has one small overindulged dog. So it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome Professor Jaye, Chrystal Jaye, to the stage. Please join with me in welcoming her.
Can you hear me all right? Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction, both Richard and Linley. Now, before I begin, there's just a few people. Let's see if I can get that going. There we go. A few people that no longer alive that I'd like to acknowledge. So you can see that's my late collaborator, Tony Egan, my partner, Peter Bristow, my father, here and here. We were making that box. My stepmother, Pat Veldkamp, and my stepfather, who only died a fortnight ago. So there are a few other people unable to be here tonight, as Linley mentioned, my 3 sons, but also my mother, Jill Tapper, and my mother-in-law, Ethel Bristow, who is 97 and doesn't travel very easily. So when I was 21, I was married with 3 very small children and living in the small rural Southland town of Winton. I had no idea then that I would one day become a professor at the University of Otago. So I'm just going to wander down memory lane for a minute. My parents settled in Nightcaps, as Lindy said, in 1973. So as you can see, Nightcaps is a very little town, very picturesque. My father was to be the Presbyterian minister there, and my great-great-great-grandparents had farmed there about 100 years earlier. I was 10 years old. So at that time, Nightcaps had a thriving horse training and racing community, and there were almost as many horses in the town as people. And so we used to ride, it was an old trainer called Johnny Sinclair who would let us ride his horses. But anyway, when I turned 11, my parents had the prescience to give me a horse of my very own. And my horse, this is her here, Shaba, that's me when I was about 11 or 12. She had no fancy provenance. She came from a small herd that ran wild on one of the nearby hill farms. A local horse trainer had her for about 3 days, and then she was mine. I spent every hour of my adolescence when not in school on horseback. And my horse was spiteful, cantankerous, willful, stubborn, prone to biting, bucking and bolting. She used to frequently break out of her small paddock, form a posse of other breakouts. These were race horses that she'd incite to ride as she galloped through the town. And they'd stampede over the Nightcaps golf course, which of course didn't make either of us very popular with golf club members or horse trainers. She would walk perilously close to barbed wire fences. I had many ripped gumboots. She'd sit down crossing creeks in the summer, which I learnt to just sit on top of her instead of getting off. She'd shy at imaginary dangers. But she was mine, and I absolutely adored her. My parents never suspected that I faced death every time I rode her. And it never occurred to me that I should perhaps mention this to them. I've often wondered to what extent all of those near-death experiences, and believe me, I still have the scars, formed the adult I became. I learnt to face the unknown and certain death head on. And an apt metaphor for life, I think, became when your horse throws you off, you pick yourself up off the ground, check all movable parts are still working, catch your horse, get back on, and just get on with it. And the other important memory I wanted to share was our holidays. School holidays were always spent adventuring, camping and tramping in central Otago. And because my father was the Presbyterian minister, we could always take the holidays off somehow. And so this is mostly around Glenorchy, but my father grew up there. And about the time we moved to Nightcaps, we acquired a family crib, this place here, in black and white. And that's me and a friend on horseback. And here, that's also me, but you can't really see me. So this was near Paradise in Glenorchy, and it became our holiday base. So most of our school holidays were spent exploring the head of the lake in my father's beloved 1942 Willys Jeep, here, and here. As you can see, it always had about 1 million kids hanging off it. This was in the off-road, but before the days of seatbelts, and there were always, a heap of kids perilously in danger of losing legs. So where it couldn't go, we hiked. And I consider myself very fortunate to have had these experiences. And looking back, I think I can see that my academic career has benefited from many of the values instilled from this childhood. Notably, I think pragmatism and perseverance and a desire to get the job done. So fast forward 7 years from being a Winton housewife, and I was living in Golden Bay at the top of the South Island as a solo mum on a benefit with 3 young children. I drank a lot of old moot cider back before it became trendy and when it was cheap and truly terrible. And I had a lot of fun playing with my 3 kids and playing in a pretty awful band, and feel free to have a giggle. So what became apparent to me during that period was that with no skills or qualifications, I could look forward to doing seasonal orchard work and earning the minimum wage for the rest of my life. So in 1991, I moved my young family to Dunedin, and I was admitted to a BA at University of Otago, as Lindy's already said. I majored in social anthropology with a minor in religious studies, and following my honours year, I embarked on a PhD. And so 33 years later, here I am, delivering an IPL. So it's customary in IPLs to note major influences on your academic career, and I would like to acknowledge my father, Ivan Smith, again. He reinvented himself several times over his adult life. He left school to work in the Glenorchy scheelite mines at the age of 14 to help support his 9 younger siblings. He gained a grade A mechanic certificate before buying and working a quartz gold mine at Skippers, and then he returned to Glenorchy as a roading contractor, all before he was 25. And he was responsible for a large chunk of the Glenorchy Road. And I have another photograph to show. Famous photograph, famous in the family, but this was actually also the advertisement for, I can't remember what breed of diesel. The caption read, "God makes mountains and man moves them." So anyway, and an accident resulting in life-threatening injuries and a long rehabilitation resulted in a total change of direction. One of his friends at his funeral said this was akin to Sir Colin Mead announcing at the peak of his rugby career that he was going to ditch rugby to take up ballet. And so in this case, Dad shifted his family to Dunedin to study Greek and theology before we moved to Nightcaps as the Presbyterian minister. And when the parish went broke in the 1970s, he turned to fixing machinery at the Ojai coal mines and retired as the foreman of the underground tradesmen. He's sort of done a full circle. So the major academic influence during my years as a student was the brilliant anthropologist, Professor Peter Wilson. Now, I tried so hard to find a photograph of Peter, and this is one from my graduation day, which I managed to locate. He's become incredibly elusive, the elusive Peter Wilson. But he wrote several highly influential and engaging books, which you can see there. I have a feeling that he was actually the inaugural professor of social anthropology. But his classes were just riveting and thought-provoking, and I've got really fond memories of fourth-year classes held under the cherry tree on the lawn in front of the clock tower in spring. And Sue Carswell, if you're watching this, you'll remember those too, because we were in the same class. Now, Peter's anthropology had extraordinary depth and width, and he kindly agreed to be my primary PhD supervisor. And the lesson that I learnt from Peter was the things we take as the most ordinary and mundane are actually the most extraordinary and deserving of anthropological attention. Peter encouraged me to go wide in my PhD thesis, which explored the intersection of medicine and religion over human suffering and the responses to it. So medical anthropology, of course, is underpinned by assumptions that affliction is universal across the existence of humanity, and that all human communities and societies have responded to this through the development of knowledge, competencies, and specialist roles. I was intrigued by something I read in an Anthony Giddens book. I can't remember which one now, but it suggested that medicine and religion are both sociocultural responses to the human experience of affliction and suffering, and that the aims of both, to restore equilibrium, comprise this response. So I conducted ethnographic research exploring the meanings of suffering and help-seeking strategies of 4 groups. One was Christian Pentecostals, one was the local congregation of Christian Scientists, there were secular medical doctors and Christian medical doctors. So long story short, and perhaps unsurprisingly, individuals' understandings were related to their understandings of self-deity, humanity and embodiment, and of course aligned with broader explanatory frameworks of their affiliations. I developed the notion of embodied integrity as a framework that encompassed both material and non-material understandings and experiences of embodiment and wholeness. But I never went any further with this very interesting work, and the hard copies of my PhD thesis were destined to prop up the computer screens on my office desk, and some of you will remember that. So anyway, in 1999, brimming with youthful energy and enthusiasm, I was appointed, as Lindy said, to a lecturer position in the then Department of General Practice. And I've always described myself as a medical anthropologist, but over the years I've sometimes wondered if health researcher with a background in anthropology is a more accurate description. And this is because I've often worried if I've travelled in a different direction to developments in my discipline of origin, not least because I don't teach in an anthropology program, and nor am I'm not confident that I'm up to date with the latest literature. In fact, I know I'm not. And as I've grappled with my occasional crises of disciplinary identity, I eventually realised that it is my anthropological lenses, which is the result of anthropological training, that has the greatest impact on the way that I approach research, how I read and interpret data, and the conclusions that I draw. As Michel Foucault observed, disciplines represent ways of knowing, seeing, and interpreting the world. And the theoretical framework that informs my own anthropology and underpins my work is an orientation to social constructionism that's combined with a commitment to the critical interpretive medical anthropological projects of embodiment and political economy. That's quite a mouthful. But my own theoretical lenses reflect the anthropologists, sociologists and social theorists, of course, that had the most impact on me. Notably Clifford Geertz, Pierre Bourdieu, Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, Margaret Locke, Arthur Kleinman, and of course Michel Foucault. So this orienting theoretical perspective is very much reflected in the fact that my research is predominantly reliant on qualitative methodologies. And this is a great segue into the anthropological imagination, which is what I want to talk about next. As an undergraduate, I remember being enthralled with Marilyn Strathern's 1987 article entitled Out of Context, The Persuasive Fictions of Anthropology. It's a fabulous title. And I can't remember what year we did that, and it might have been third or fourth year probably. But amongst other things, it introduced me to the idea that anthropologists and their anthropologies are situated within generational or cohort horizons. And of course, this is reflected in their theoretical toolkits. And at this time, a younger generation of anthropologists, including Paul Rabinow, George Marcus and Michael Fisher, had been reflecting deeply on the political association of anthropology with colonialism and its role in constructing the other. The discursive nature of the concept of culture, fundamental to anthropology, had been recently exposed as an exercise in interpretive and constructionist fiction. And ethnography, the distinctive methodology of anthropology, is a highly problematic constructive praxis. Angst-ridden discussions, aided by the very affordable boxed wine known as FRC, at frequent potlucks of my social anthropology cohort, reflected these burning theoretical and methodological issues. What was the point of social anthropology? Was ethnography morally and ethically justifiable? Did the data we collected mean anything at all beyond our own imaginings? Was it ever possible to get out of one's own way? Were we simply perpetuating colonial epistemological violence? Now, according to Jennifer Gossetti-Ferenczi, imagination is integral to culture and to cognition. Without imagination, creativity and innovation would be impossible. David Sneath and colleagues observed in 2009 that the social imaginary, which is attributed to philosopher Charles Taylor, has become increasingly trendy in social anthropology, not least because it provides a substitute for the vexatious baggage associated with the term culture. And this social imaginary is evident in Clifford Geertz's 1973 claim that culture is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And of course, for social anthropologists, the notion of the social imaginary is delightfully opaque and indeterminate, because imagination is central to the tasks of anthropology. Following Geertz, anthropology itself could be described as the stories we tell about ourselves and others, and in the process of doing so, we're actively constructing both ourselves and the others that we research. The imagination is central to understanding the entanglements, the disentanglements, and the positionality implicit in reflective research. And the analysis and interpretation of ethnographic and qualitative data requires creativity and playfulness and intuition, which are all imaginative qualities. According to George Marcus and Michael Fisher, the central endeavour of anthropology is cultural critique, and it's underpinned by the understanding that all culture is humanly constructed, eloquently phrased by Geertz as webs of significance that we ourselves spin. I've always loved this quote, even though it was written a long, long time ago. C. Wright Mills described a sociological imagination that encompasses the relationship between individuals, communities, and socio-historical contexts. So what's an anthropological imagination? According to Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, one of my favourite anthropologists, in medical anthropology, the anthropological imagination orients around the critique of medicine and medical practices around health, subjective illness experiences, and the articulations of these within cultural, political, ecological, and societal contexts. Harry Walcott, who's another of my faves, framed anthropological critique in terms of the difference between looking and seeing. Reflexivity and engagement, of course, are the key characteristics of the latter kind of vision. Bingstein and Hazard argue that the anthropological imagination is an attitude of critical reflection towards common sense, which brings us back to my old supervisor, Peter Wilson. In learning to see anthropologically, the ordinary and the taken for granted become problematic, so that one's own life is no longer sensible, but peculiar and unique. It's the result of global and local, historical, political and economic, etc. processes. And I was hoping to capture some of this in my IPL poster. So here you can see that I'm holding a posy of flowers, and these are wildflowers that have been picked along a popular cycling track near Clyde, where I live, and they tell many different stories, all of which illustrate and provoke imagination. So first of all, I find them aesthetically appealing, and their presence in the landscape is emblematic of the palette of Central Otago that I'm familiar with and very fond of. And of course, because the photograph's in black and white, you're going to have to take my word for this and use your own imaginations. This is the blue of Viper's bugloss, the white of feverfew, white clover, horehound and yarrow, purple of thyme and buddleia, the pink of sweetbriar and mallow, the red of red spur valerian, and the yellows and golds of mullein, evening primrose and Californian poppy. And they also represent the medicinal toolkit imported by European colonial settlers to Aotearoa, and thus continuity with what Arthur Kleinman might have described as the repertoire of several European folk health care sectors. But at the same time, these pretty flowers are visible reminders of colonisation and its impacts, the violent reshaping of the Aotearoa landscape through farming and mining, and the construction of infrastructure, such as railways. And of course, the emblematic sweetbriar and thyme, which cover the Central Otago hills today, are the feral descendants of early capitalist ventures in the area. So next, I want to move on and draw on my research record to illustrate or perhaps expose the application of my anthropological imagination through my academic career. So in preparing for this lecture, I've assembled my research, which covers a bewildering array of horizons. I've tried to organise it into thematic categories, which itself was a highly imaginative exercise. And I apologise because these slides are quite busy, although I'm only going to elaborate on one or two examples from each category. But I need to say also that while I use the term imagination to describe the analytical and interpretive work of anthropology, this in no way implies that the lived and embodied experiences of research participants are not real. So the first really strong theme is imagining clinical education, and actually you'll see in these that where I have these are students student research where I have been a supervisor, so that's what that means. A strong thread running throughout my academic career concerns medical education, and the question that's long interested social scientists and medical educators alike, which is, what are medical students really learning in medical school? Arguably, the purpose of medical curricula is to produce the kinds of doctors that society wants, and you can read any set of undergraduate medical course learning objectives to get a sense of that. It's well documented that all learning environments expose students to unofficial, informal, and frequently undeclared normative practices that might or might not be congruent with the messaging of the formal and official curricula. And you're likely familiar with the term hidden curriculum, which connotes this phenomenon. So in medical education, the hidden curriculum is said to encompass unofficial but implicit expectations, unintended learning outcomes, behaviour that's modelled by teachers and clinicians, medical student culture, and other things as well. My late former colleague, Tony Egan, was a well-recognised expert on clinical education, and I worked with him on several projects. And the first of these, in the very early noughties, focused on medical educators, and it showed that medical educators, or at least the ones who were motivated to participate in our study, used role modelling to counteract the negative messages that they thought students were receiving through the hidden curriculum. This included not taking consent seriously enough, informed consent, or being disrespectful of patients through lateness, discourtesy, or inappropriate humour. And in this study, participants identified an explicit tension between the institutional goals and the formal learning objectives of the medical school and the clinical settings in which medical students do much of their learning. So the key finding here was that the hidden curriculum equips students with values, attitudes, and behaviours that are aligned with the medical profession, which they will join after graduation. And this led to a study using ethnographic methods in which medical students were shadowed on ward rounds by Dr. Kelby Smith-Hahn, who would go on to conduct his own PhD research on discourses of general practice that students encounter during medical school and their influences on vocational choice. So this study showed that Teaching and learning opportunities were often missed because, of course, service provision and patient care are necessarily the priority for clinicians. Students often felt excluded on ward rounds, and they expressed ambivalence about their educational value. They didn't consider themselves to be a member of the team when they felt in the way, but they did when they felt useful and were included in team discussions about patient care. And students reported that they learned more effectively on smaller educationally focused ward rounds that incorporated bedside tutorials and opportunities to practice examination skills. So these were the findings that were presented in the New Zealand Medical Journal and somewhere else, I've forgotten what. But the really interesting stuff was published in Anthropology and Medicine and also in Health, where we used Foucault's social theory to show that medical schools are disciplinary blocks, that medical curricula represent normalising technologies of self. And Etienne Wenger's Communities of Practice model describes a mechanism by which students engage with the professional technologies in the clinical workplace. So very briefly, communities of practice often form organically around a shared vision or purpose, and they're distinguished by insider shared values and practices. We termed this communities of clinical practice, or COCP, and we showed that these are potent vehicles for students' internalisation of the normative professional behaviours and values that lead them to become one of the medical tribe, one of us. And Google Scholar tells me that this work's been cited over 500 times, which for those of you who are not anthropologists is pretty extraordinary. So anyway, there's reassurance that's been of relevance. Now the second thematic that I wanted to draw on is imagining primary healthcare and general practice. And in this theme, I want to focus on a project investigating general practitioner obstetrics, GPOs for short. Around 2008, Dr. Dawn Miller, who is a colleague in the Department of Women's and Children's Health, invited me to be part of a project exploring the decline of general practitioner obstetricians following a change in maternity care funding model in the 1990s that saw GPO numbers plummet. Now, prior to 1990, GPOs provided most of New Zealand's maternity and obstetric care, but by 2004, only about 5% of pregnant women registered with a GPO as their lead maternity care provider. So at that time, there was a midwife shortage, and the Ministry of Health was interested in attracting GPs back to maternity care to help alleviate this. So we set out to find what distinguished the few GPOs still providing maternity care from those who had withdrawn. Our participants considered that the contemporary LMC model isolated the maternity care providers, and this made them very vulnerable, particularly in rural areas. It also wasn't adequately funded enough for GP participation. So those GPs who were still providing maternity care viewed it as an integral part of general practice, and they often did workarounds in the form of under-the-table local shared care arrangements with other maternity providers. So the key finding was that if GPs were to be enticed back to maternity care, the legislation and funding would need to support shared maternity care. These were the findings that were published in the Journal of Primary Healthcare and also in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. However, the article published in Medical Anthropology called Tossing Out the Baby with the Bathwater, which I have to say is my favourite title of all of my publications. It drew on Michel Foucault's social theory to show how the landscape of maternity care is made up of truth games generated by the disciplinary blocks of the maternity care professions and stakeholders, revealing the highly moral nature of the political economy of maternity care. So specifically, the former GPOs who participated in our study harboured deep grievances relating to the loss of obstetrics from the previous cradle-to-grave philosophy of general practice and the policies that at that time encouraged competition between maternity care providers. In this terrain, contested and competing discourses were evident around the physiology and the management of pregnancy and childbirth. What's normal and or natural? What constitutes risk? How should it be managed? And what constitutes safe clinical practice? And most importantly, who should deliver it? Another strong theme throughout my research career is ageing, and I want to pick up on a relatively recent research project funded by a University of Otago research grant. In 2018, the news media highlighted various crises in rural health service availability and access and workforce shortages in rural regions. As I mentioned previously, midwifery was one of these. Fiona Doolan-Noble, who was then a colleague in the Department of General Practice and Rural Health, now working at Curtin University, and is a rural researcher with a nursing background, invited myself she was part of the research team with myself and Associate Professor Lincoln Wood in the Department of Management, and we were ably assisted by Judy McHugh. But we set out to explore how health was maintained and how health needs were met in an isolated small Otago community. COVID intervened, and by the time we'd actually completed our data collection and analysis, I think we realised that the data were telling several stories that were much more complex than what we'd anticipated. On the face of it, participants described health in terms of well-being and satisfaction with rural lifestyle and community participation. But we were struck by participants' descriptions of the articulation between community, environment and individual ability. And this attracted us to the dual thematics of asset-based community and Jennifer Praruga's health capability framework. The health capability framework is, in a nutshell, the freedom to choose to be healthy and the ability to achieve this, being dependent on contextual issues in motivation, ability, previous choices, of course, and the available options. Rurality, as many of you are aware, is frequently described in terms of deficit comparisons to urban populations. And the asset-based approaches of Jakes, Matthew and Cunningham sought to remedy this by focusing on the ways in which local rural assets can support community agency, autonomy and empowerment. In our study, participants referenced health in terms of well-being that was strongly supported by the local assets of the community. And so this included community support networks, landscape, livestock, family history, rural lifestyle and values. And they also talked about capabilities required to be rural fit, in particular mobility and physical functioning. However, behind participants' accounts of well-being lay several potential threats, and this led to the imagining of a third thematic, latent precarity. While precarity has been typically defined in terms of employment and income security, we identified several forms of precarity that lurked in the background of even the most successful rural lives and livelihoods. These included latent economic precarity, particularly for farmers. This was the ups and downs of global markets, weather events such as the one we've just had. Latent social precarity described the potential impacts of social isolation for rural dwellers of all ages, while latent functional precarity concerned potential declines in physical capabilities, and it was particularly associated with ageing. Grenier and colleagues had observed that precarity is disempowering. It can also have a domino effect. So if a latent form of precarity becomes actual or experienced precarity, then a lifestyle can become unsustainable very rapidly. Ageing adds additional forms of latent precarity, and it exacerbates existing rural latent precarities for older adults. However, latent precarities can be managed and experienced precarities mitigated. And we concluded that this depends on the balance of individual capabilities and community assets. So we confirmed what others, such as Nora Keating in the Canadian context, have already said. If we want rural communities to be good places to grow old in, then national rural health and ageing policies need to be better aligned with meso-level regional policy and with community-level initiatives. Now, the concept of latent precarities is a good segue into the last project that I wanted to talk about this evening, which is imagining Mycoplasma bovis. So this is what you've been waiting for, Jeff. If high levels of stress and mental health issues, of course, are well documented within the New Zealand agricultural sector, and in 2017, the latent precarity of contagious stock disease was actualised for farmers in several regions, including Southland, Otago and Canterbury in the South Island, in the form of an outbreak of Mycoplasma bovis. Now, this is an exotic bacterium that causes mastitis and arthritis in adult cattle and pneumonia in calves. And in May 2018, the Ministry for Primary Industries, MPI for short, announced the implementation of a biosecurity intervention with the aim of eradicating N. bovis from New Zealand. And Professor Doolin Noble invited me to collaborate on a project that would be funded by Lotteries Health Research, exploring the psychosocial impacts of the outbreak on affected rural communities in Southland and Otago. So the team included myself and Dr. Jeff Noller, another anthropologist, who's here today, and Mark Bryan, a veterinary epidemiologist in Southland. And this project offers a really neat illustration of the ways in which multidisciplinary, not just anthropological imaginations, are reflected in the stories that become reified in academic publications. Initially, and while we waited for the outcome of our lottery's health application, we followed the M. bovis drama as it unfolded through the news media like the rest of New Zealand. But this interest translated into a summer student project conducted by Dr. Caitlin Boyce. And the resulting publication revealed the story of M. bovis as told through the news media. So here farmers were portrayed as ordinary people desperately trying to save their livestock, fighting a microscopic foreign viral invader at the same time as fighting with the structural violence of the bureaucratic regulatory apparatus administrated by MPI through the M. bovis eradication program. The Lottery's Health Project showed that farmers endured disruption to the seasonal rhythms of farming and income because of the M. bovis outbreak, but the processes of the eradication program itself exacerbated the traumatic impacts of the outbreak. In fairness, this was the largest biosecurity intervention enacted to date in New Zealand, and it was acknowledged by MPI to be a massive learning experience. So this is what we reported in the first submitted manuscript, and we could have left it there. But we went on to tell several other stories that reflected team analysis sessions and the interpretive synthesis of our disciplinary imaginations. We drew upon Habermas's system and life world framework to explore the collision between paddock and policy around the highly contested application of a clause from the primary sector recovery policy, which guided the intervention, specifically that recipients of Crown compensation for losses that are the result of the actions of the Crown, and this referred to stock culls. Some farmers lost entire herds more than once. So recipients should be, quote, no better or worse off than others who are not eligible for compensation, end quote. And a data excerpt in this particular publication describing how a team of MPI cleaners spent days cleaning screws removed from a contaminated cow shed so the farmer wouldn't be better off, instead of buying a box of new screws for the refit, which is much cheaper in case you were wondering, went viral throughout the New Zealand news media. So Habermas's framework enabled us to tell a story about the colonisation of the farm life world by bureaucracy, and in short, the imposition of bureaucratic policy and praxis over rural and farming pragmatism. We also illustrated how cattle beasts embodied several forms of moral capital within the moral economy of the farm, an adaptation of Pierre Bourdieu's symbolic forms of capital. According to Anne-Marie Moll, the farm is a moral economy because animals require care in order to survive and thrive. Being a good farmer, stock productivity and heritage breeding all reflect forms of moral capital, and the economic worth of these forms of moral capital was fiercely asserted by farmers over and above the paper value of a stock unit and compensation claims. And similarly, we realised the participants were describing their journeys through the eradication process in a way that evoked Van Gennep's and later Victor Turner's descriptions of liminality. In a nutshell, liminality consists of three phases. So the first is separation from normal life and or social status. The second is a period of sequestering apart from one's community. And the third is the reintegration back into society with a new identity or social status. So each phase is often marked by ritual. And in the case of M. bovis, it was certification by MPI officials that provided a passage across these thresholds. So the eradication program showed a progression through 3 distinct phases for impacted farmers, each associated with ambiguity, confusion and uncertainty. An official separation from usual farming routines was triggered by the suspicion of M. bovis on a property. Farmers were sequestered with this somewhat alarming signage affixed to their fences while they waited for test results, stock culls, stand down periods and then compensation claim outcomes. An official release from the intervention program and permission to resume farming business was the final phase. However, while the liminality of M. bovis was anchored on the farm's property boundaries, the liminal space of bovis lingered long after the official exit of the farm from liminal status. And farmers carried forward the trauma of the experience and an ambiguous social status, not least having to repair their reputations of being a good farmer and stock trader. So turning our attention to the frontline worker interviews, we showed that local veterinarians experienced moral distress during the early intervention days when veterinarians who were working with the local farmers were sidelined by the eradication program. And we also showed that frontline workers were working within a boundary space brought into existence by the outbreak, and which was characterised by instability, chaos and flux. While meeting their various operational briefs within this space, frontline workers brokered several things. These were knowledge and information, resources and materials, but they also brokered relationships between the intervention program and the community, specifically for the benefit of their farmer clients, who were often also neighbours. And this led to frontline workers describing their in-between positioning as somewhat ambiguous, because they carried quite ambivalent status in the eyes of farmers and MPI. So farmers frequently viewed them as agents of the bureaucracy. MPI viewed them as local add-ons. In a briefing paper to the then Minister for Primary Industries, we offered a set of recommendations for implementing biosecurity interventions that have appeared in subsequent MPI documents. So specifically seeking solutions from within rural communities that included regional and interprofessional networks, and the formation of a standing army of rurally based experts in various fields who can be called upon to help shape process and policy for the next inevitable biosecurity incursion. And this work's already received about 50 citations in only 3 years. At this point, I want to say something about the concept of moral economies, which has emerged very strongly as a meta-theme, threading through much of my research while I've prepared this lecture. In my earlier research career, this thread is more implicit and covert. For example, exploring the moral standpoints of sufferers of what was known as occupational overuse syndrome in the early noughties and the health professionals that treated them. In the last 10 years or so, it's become a more persistent and explicit thematic, exploring forms of moral capital that circulate within moral economies. So that's a slide that shows some of that work. I've talked about M. bovis, but there are many other projects here that I haven't mentioned. It might seem like stating the obvious to say that healthcare is deeply moral. For a start, as Arthur Kleinman has observed, it involves the recognition of the need for care in others and the capacity to respond to this need. In New Zealand, equity and fairness within the healthcare system are well recognised as human rights and therefore moral issues. Vulnerability and deservingness, living a healthy lifestyle, being a good patient are all forms of moral capital that citizens can trade for healthcare. And the theoretical framework of moral capital has been much more fully developed and extended by a former PhD student of myself and Professor Peter Crampton, Dr. Patrick Bartosh, in a recent Social Science and Medicine publication. So I have a few concluding remarks to make. Learning to see anthropologically is intrinsic to the process of learning anthropology. In 2005, I wrote that within the dispersed and reflexive discourses and praxis of postmodern anthropology, there are no equivalents to clinical guidelines, only the experiences, interpretations, and critical theoretical reflections of other situated anthropologists, working within an enormous variety of settings, fields, and traditions, and interlocking communities of practice. Our own anthropological imaginations are the primary instrument in our disciplinary toolkit by which to come back to Geertz. We tell stories about ourselves and others because any story about others is, of course, at the same time a story about ourselves. And in the process, we imagine ourselves, we imagine others, and we imagine our own anthropologies. My own career has reflected a particular moment in time in New Zealand anthropology. And I think medical anthropology in New Zealand will continue to evolve as it reflects the anthropological imaginings of contemporary and future cohorts of medical anthropologists. As Marilyn Strathen noted in 1987, the fictions that anthropology creates through the process of interpreting and theorising in order to understand complex social phenomena must in turn be critically examined as the socially constructed frames and representations that they are. So what does an anthropological imagination add? What's its value in a medical school, in a health sciences faculty or division? What I've observed in teaching health professionals, mostly general practitioners, is students developing and flexing their own anthropological imaginations during my courses, applying anthropological interpretations to things they'd previously taken for granted, and using this to challenge their own clinical students to take a wider and more critical look at the truths of biomedicine, to consider the standpoints and knowledges of others, to be reflexive, and to situate their own practice within broader political and moral economies. I think the student evaluation that I was most chuffed with came from a GP teacher who wrote something along the lines of, "Chris taught me that everything I thought was real isn't." So adding anthropological imaginations to the disciplinary imaginations of health professional academics adds enormous value to health sciences research. The benefits can be at a clinical consultation level. Medical anthropologies contributed enormously to improving cultural competency in clinical settings and to our understanding of what it's like for patients, for clinical students and health professionals, and as Arthur Kleinman observed, what matters to them. It's also contributed enormously to exposing and explaining health inequity and the structural violence of health systems and the global forces that perpetuate these. As Nancy Barnes observed in 1992, an anthropological imagination is also about imagining radically different human possibilities. Professor Catherine Panter-Brick in 2018 argued that by framing conversations about health in terms of, quote, moral values, political power, structural vulnerabilities, historical legacies, clinical care and ecological relationships, end quote, amongst other things, medical anthropology challenges disciplinary imperialism. It's not entirely clear to me if Panter-Brick was referring to the disciplines of anthropology or medicine, but the sentiment is certainly applicable to both. She writes that, quote, medical anthropology sits at the intersection of the humanities, social sciences and biological sciences, seeking to transform our understanding of what matters to people in terms of health and well-being, end quote. And this is why medical anthropologists and other social scientists belong in a medical school and in health sciences faculties and divisions. All academics bring their own disciplinary imaginations and theoretical toolkits to research. And I contend that when a research team has an anthropologist or two, or any kind of social scientist for that matter, the collective team toolkit is vastly expanded. The recognition of patterns, both descriptive and latent, within any data set is always dependent on the disciplinary imaginations brought to bear on it. The stories we tell through our research outputs not only reflect our imaginings, but also develop and extend our disciplines. In multidisciplinary research teams, the potential exists for analytical and interpretive synergies that are far greater than the sum of the team's individual parts. So I want to finish by thanking my three sons whose childhood was largely dominated by my studies. Ironically, by the time I finally finished and got a real paying job, they'd all left home. So I also want to say thank you to the many research students, some of whom are here today, that I've supervised over the years for all the conversations that have enriched my life, because supervision has been the favourite part of my job. I always loved it. I've learned so much from all of my students. Thank you very much to all my past and present colleagues and workmates in general practice and rural health and the wider university community and the Division of Health Sciences. To my parents and all my friends, there's too many of you to thank individually, but you all know who you are. And lastly, thanks to everyone for attending my IPL, either by person or by video link, and particularly my grandchildren, who probably have better things to be doing on a Thursday evening. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Tim Stokes. I am Professor of General Practice and Head of Department of General Practice and Rural Health in School of Medicine. And it's a real pleasure to be able to end Chrystal Jaye's Inaugural Professorial lecture by offering a few words about the significance of her IPL. I think the first thing I'd like to say is anthropological imagination. Chris brought her anthropological imagination to research across a broad areas of health sciences. Her body of research, as you can see, is eclectic, but it is held together by a strong, unified theoretical perspective on the anthropological imagination, expressed through a number of areas, for example, human clinical practice, moral economies, general practice and primary health care. And I just want to reflect on three of those, drawing on Chris's CV. Chris is a distinguished anthropologist. She has published certainly 3 papers which have H indexes of above 100, one paper nearly 300. That, for someone working in the social sciences, is extremely high praise. Multiply that by maybe 10 or 100 if you're working in quantitative research. The first of those papers, published in Health in 2009, was on community clinical practice. And that's just one of a number of papers, because Chris built a program of research on community clinical practice over a number of years, involving some of the people here, and also, I think, most importantly, who's not here, who passed away a few years ago, is Tony Egan, who many of us remember well. The second paper, I think the Google Scholar hit rate's nearly 170, was called What is Spirituality? Published in Mortality. Again, Chris has worked with many colleagues over the last few years to develop a strong research program of work around spirituality, working with many people collaborative in Otago, Richard Egan, for example, and also Jess Young, who is here on assisted dying. And the third area of work that she worked with, which she alluded to, was work with people like me, people like general practitioners, okay? And she commented on the body of work that she'd done in this field very well. And a number of people here, I see Anne Eastwood here, who I think did your Masters of General Practice with Chris many years ago. But I also want to reflect on one particular paper. And this paper is number 3. It has a citation rate of 110. It's a paper just by Chrystal Jaye. And it's published in the journal Family Practice in 2002. And in 2002, Family Practice was one of the House-ranked journals of primary healthcare internationally. It was called, if I recall, Qualitative Research and Family Practice. And the importance of that paper were twofold. The first importance in the literature was that Chris delineated the way that qualitative research was used, not only in general practice departments, but also in public health medicine departments, and probably wasn't actually used in medical student department back in those days. Because if you go back to the 1990s and 2000s, there was very little qualitative research done in medical schools. And to do it was actually seen as a mildly deviant activity. So Chris's achievement should be seen as being part of, over the last 20, 30 years, of transforming the field so that it is now normal to think qualitatively. It is now normal in some cases to think sociologically and indeed anthropologically. That paper emphasized the importance of theory in building ideas, and also emphasised the importance of working with health practitioners, not just GPs, but other practitioners, to actually use theory in their own research, qualitative research, and thereby enrich the field. And Chris has been hugely influential in that. And the last thing I want to say is reflect on that paper from a personal level. Because I was in 2002, I just finished a PhD in the UK. I worked with a medical sociologist, and it was primarily using Goffman's work on interactionist sociology to explain difficulties between patients. I read Chris's paper and thought, this is great, really interesting. It was one of these papers that was building the field for us to work with social scientists in general practice departments. Also, some of the work that Chris has supervised, I think it might have been Wayne Nichols' work, was around removing patients, and my own work had been on removing patients from doctors' lists. So we corresponded. Chris very kindly offered me some comments on one of my PhD papers, which I look back today and saw I did actually acknowledge you, on some model building, which was really liked. And on the personal note, that contact with Chris led me to come and run a seminar out of the department on a long holiday in New Zealand in 2005. And then out the blue in 2013, a headhunting firm asked me if I would like to come and take on the job I have now, the chair of general practice. I remembered my work with Chris, and I remembered the work that this department did, and I won't go into that story, but it is the reason I'm here. So I would like to close really by thanking Chris for your work as a colleague, and I haven't even said about all the support you've given me over the years and others over the years in your department. You've always been someone who's put other people first, who's supported other people's careers, developed their careers, and you gave me lots of wise counsel when I came into the department, first of all, and also in my early days as head of departments. So thank you again, and thank you so much for a wonderful IPL. I haven't quite finished yet because you have a gift, and it's my pleasure to give you a gift from the university. You might be able to guess what's in it. So there's something wrapped it with a Otago, and there is also a envelope, but they obviously don't like surprises because it says University Bookshop on it, so we know what that
is. Kia ora, he mihi mahana, kia koutou. Thank you for that, Chris. I think It really shows us what the journey that you've been on, but also the influence that it's had. And recently we did a strategy day in the division, and Chris is my associate dean postgraduate. And she said, oh, I really like that stuff you put in there around how the music industry's changed. How are we going to change education? So I'm ready to take you up on that offer now. So we're looking forward to seeing what we do in the education space, because I think you've already made a massive change. So thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome you all now to join us at the Staff Club to continue to celebrate the night that is Professor Jaye. So join us there.